This is the Franklin C45. It's the first power paddle released from Franklin in, well, maybe ever. There's some interesting new tech in this paddle that you're going to want to know about. Also, this paddle absolutely needs some modification to open up its potential, which I'll explain later. Let's get into it. First, a disclosure. Franklin sent me these paddles to test for a potential review with no obligations. No money changed hands, and Franklin did not have any input on this video's production or get to preview it before it was published. But if you use my affiliate code to purchase one of these paddles, you get a discount and I get a commission, which helps this channel and allows me to keep making videos like this. The Franklin C45 costs $230, and you can take 10% off that with the code JOHNQ. This is a hybrid-shaped paddle, so it falls between elongated and wide body. You can see the specific dimensions on this chart. Currently, only one shape is being offered, this hybrid shape, and only one thickness, 14 millimeters. The C45 will be offered in other shapes later this year, such as the Dynasty and the Tempo. Also, this is a dual certified paddle, so it has the USAP stamp on one side and the UPAA stamp on the other, which means you can play with it at any sanctioned tournament. So some interesting technology went into this paddle, with the goal being to minimize the break-in period. And by break-in, I mean the paddle becoming much hotter, which is what Franklin is trying to avoid. As you can see from this x-ray, there is a dual foam edge wall along the sides and the top of the paddle. There's a standard outer edge foam band that extends throughout the entire perimeter of the paddle, and there's an inner foam wall that extends further into the polypropylene honeycomb along the sides and the top. So I also dissected this same paddle, and the plan view cut confirms what we saw in the x-ray. You can see a polypropylene honeycomb center and a dual foam edge wall. There's a yellowish outer edge foam that extends along the entire perimeter of the paddle, even down into the handle. This is typical of Gen 2 thermoformed paddles, but there's an additional softer white foam inside the edge foam, which extends only along the sides and the top. The outer edge foam is more firm and it crumbles when you poke at it, like all open cell expanding foam. The inner foam is softer and more resilient, and it looks very much like what Yola introduced with their propulsion core. In fact, here's a dissected Mod TA15, and you can see that the interior looks very similar. The main difference here is that the Mod polypropylene cells are crushed. You can see here that the cells have lost their octagonal shape and are just smashed, flattened, amorphous blobs. So this is a promising sign that Franklin has decided not to compress their cores, given that compressed cores are known to break fairly quickly. They also use a two-step thermoforming process that, as far as I know, is new in the industry. This involves an initial low pressure and low heat treatment of an entire block of the core and surface layup before the paddle shapes are cut out. Then they cut out the paddle shapes, machined out the areas for foam, and added foam inserts, and then put this into a mold for a second stage of thermoforming. They also did something interesting with the surface layup. It's 3 layers of unidirectional carbon fiber on each face, which is pretty standard, but what's different is the orientation of the carbon fiber sheets. Instead of going the standard 0, 90 degrees, 0, they went 45, 0, 45 degrees, which when you align the unidirectional carbon fiber sheets at 90 degrees to each other, it makes a very stiff paddle face. And when you reduce that angle to 45 degrees, it makes a softer face. You can see here that as I pull back the top layer of carbon fiber, it's oriented at 45 degrees to the axis of the paddle. And digging deeper, the second layer is oriented at 0 degrees along the paddle's long axis. And finally, the bottom layer is oriented again at 45 degrees. So now you know how the C45 got its name. The C stands for carbon, which is placed at 45 degrees. Let's get into some performance data here before we get into how everything comes together on the court. As a reminder, I'm using a Stalker 3S radar gun to capture ball velocity and spin, using various types of shots to replicate power and pop. And I'm measuring swing weight, twist weight, and balance point to help understand things like hand speed and sweet spot. The boxes at the top of this graphic give you the raw numbers, and the radar chart on the bottom shows where these numbers fall in terms of percentiles for nearly 300 paddles in my database. High values over on the left side of the chart indicate more firepower, and high values on the right indicate more control and forgiveness. Lastly, the bottom of the chart tells you about maneuverability and hand speed. So this is a really lopsided chart. You've got a lot of spin, power, and pop, and all the other metrics are almost at zero. What this translates to is a power paddle with crazy fast hand speed, but also a very small sweet spot. And I'll just say it here, this paddle absolutely needs modification to reach its potential. Adding weight to this paddle is a must. I'll give you all the details on how I modified my paddle later in the video, but suffice it to say that this radar chart looks much more balanced after some perimeter weighting. Combining power and pop into a metric called firepower, the C45 scores 83 out of 100, which places it squarely in the power category. At this level, it's most comparable to other popular paddles on the market, such as the 11624 Vapor Power, Carbon True Foam Genesis, Yola Scorpius 3S, and Paddletech Bantam ESQ C14.3. As suggested by the performance metrics we just discussed, the stock C45 hits hard, but it's very light and has a smaller sweet spot. I mean, it feels like it gets pushed around by the ball because it doesn't have enough mass and plow through. So unless your main goal is wicked hand speed, I wouldn't recommend playing this paddle stock. Once you weight it up, though, it becomes a very different paddle. The pop and power are both good, but not too much so that you lose all control. And I like how the face of the paddle feels softer, probably because of a combination of the extra dwell time from the dual foam edge walls and the surface layup using carbon fiber angled at 45 degrees. And this makes for a pleasant feel when hitting the ball. And to me, it also helps with control. The spin is also good, which I think is generated through a combination of the peel ply texture used on the surface together with good dwell time. So I was able to accelerate hard through the ball and just trust that it would dip hard with topspin. And pop is exceptional with this paddle. So if you're an offensive player at the kitchen and like to instigate, attack, and counter with good success, then this paddle is a good choice. As always, the trade-off with good pop is pop-ups. So this paddle's a little harder to control through the transition zone and at the kitchen than paddles with similar firepower but lower pop, such as the 11624 Vapor Power and Yola Scorpius 3S. Power generated with full swings such as drives and serves is also good, but it's less noticeable in this paddle than pop. After weighting it up, the sweet spot is good on this paddle. I wouldn't call it oversized, but I didn't have any trouble finding the center of percussion when I was set and ready to hit the ball. So like I said earlier in this video, this paddle absolutely needs perimeter weighting. To me, it just transforms the paddle from something that felt very mid to something that's pretty special. I went through a few configurations of perimeter weighting for this paddle until I landed on something that I really liked, so let me walk you through how I did it. And this may not work for everyone, but I think it's a good kind of middle ground that a lot of people will indeed like. So I started with 2 strips of 0.5 gram per inch tungsten tape from Pickleball Effect. Each strip measures 8.5 inches, and I started about an inch above the overgrip and went all the way up the sides of the paddle, stopping just where it started curving toward the tip. So I also put on a single overgrip over the stock grip, and this also adds a bit of weight, and since it's low on the paddle, it drops the balance point a bit. I'm using Bodhi grips here, which are great if you enjoy soft and tacky grips. Lastly, I added a 9-gram flick weight at the base of the handle. This adds a bit more stability without making the paddle feel too sluggish because the weight is added below the fulcrum. So overall, I added a total of 1 ounce, bringing the static weight up from 7.5 to 8.5 ounces. The swing weight rose from 103.5 to 112.5, and really ending with a swing weight of only 112.5 after adding an entire ounce of weight is pretty crazy. And the twist weight went from a measly 5.42 all the way up to 6.92. That's a huge bump that noticeably increased the sweet spot and forgiveness of this paddle. So I ended up with a paddle that's much more forgiving and has a larger sweet spot, but still has very good hand speed. And you can find links in the description to all of these products that I talked about when I modified my paddle. So I'm pretty excited that Franklin has re-emerged in 2025 as a top-tier paddle manufacturer after a few years of what I would characterize as floundering after the last big hit, the Max Grit Ben John's signature paddle. So I started talking with Franklin's brand strategist last year, and I knew they were on the right track. So it's good to see this paddle come to fruition. One of my main concerns with this paddle, though, is what the break-in period will look like. Franklin designed this paddle with the goal of eliminating break-in altogether, which I think is a very ambitious goal if you're putting foam in the paddle. And break-in is complicated. There's not just one kind. For example, the Yola Mod TA15 is just known to break in, which involves, in this case, heating up and often reaching the point where it breaks altogether, becoming like basically a rocket launcher that's impossible to control. And that's mostly related to the polypropylene core being compressed in the factory during its manufacture. And another type of break-in is when the foam in the paddle loosens up. And this can make the paddle actually feel a little better, so it's a little more forgiving, more plush, and a bigger sweet spot without getting too crazy in terms of firepower. So the Ape's Pulse comes to mind as a paddle that does this. Still, we don't fully understand this type of break-in that relates to the foam in Gen 3 paddles, so there are a lot of unknowns still. And because the Franklin C45 doesn't use compressed polypropylene in the cores, I don't think we'll see a lot of the type of core crushing that we saw with the Mod TA15. That's not to say that it's impossible, just less likely. But I do suspect that we'll see some break-in of the C45 because of the foam in the perimeter. And like I said, this can have some benefits in terms of more forgiveness and a larger sweet spot. On the other hand, we don't fully understand where foam-related break-in ends, and some people don't want to buy a paddle that transforms into something else. All of this is to say that if break-in is a concern to you, I'd recommend just waiting to buy the C45 until after it hits the market and we have a good amount of people that start playing with it to give us an idea if it does break in. So yeah, I do think this paddle performs well and it occupies a nice spot in the paddle landscape for people who want a lightweight power paddle that's not too powerful so that you can't control it. If you do want to buy this paddle, you can take 10% off with the code JOHNQ, bringing the price down to $206. And this positions the C45 right in the middle of all the Gen 3 foam-enhanced paddles in terms of price, so in that regard, I do think it's a fair price. Okay, that's it for now. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.